with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
The question on the tip of everyone's tongue these days is, when will there be a vaccine? We're checking in on that global quest tonight and asking what Canada's contributing to the search. First up, science journalist and newly minted television host Latif Nasser explains what connects Beyonce to mathematical theory and Mississauga to Guantanamo Bay. You'll want to stick around for those answers because they actually do connect. It's Thursday, September 24th, and that's all next on the agenda. Few things inspire learning the way natural wonder does. Awe, enthusiasm, and terrific insight help too. Latif Nasser, dare I say it, Mississauga's own Latif Nasser, brings all of that to his new science docuseries on Netflix. It's called Connected, and it shows how connected we are in ways you'd never expect. Latif is Director of Research for the New York Public Radio show Radio Lab, and he joins us now from Los Angeles, California for more. Hello there, my fellow Canadian. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. I just want to, before we get too far into this conversation, show folks a little bit of what you've been up to, because it is absolutely spectacular. So stand by, and Sheldon, roll it, please.
My name is Latif Nasser. I'm a science reporter.
Oh, wow.
And this is a show about the astonishing connections all around us. Connections between you, me, and our world that'll make you see that world in a whole new way.
Very important question. Does the Queen's poop come through here?
It has a flag on it, so we salute as she comes.
Okay.
How is the cloud above your head connected to the cloud that stores your data? How can an obscure mathematical law help make sense of your favorite song?
Benford's Law.
Benford's Law.
Could you Benford Beyonce?
If anything does work, then it probably
Is Beyonce.
And let's go to Twitter now, where you introduced your program by saying, my Netflix show just went live. If I had to sum it up, it's basically if Bill Nye and Anthony Bourdain had an awkward Muslim baby, but it's more than that. Now, that's very funny, but for the uninitiated, would you care to elaborate on that tweet?
Sure. It's basically a science show where I go all over the world looking for the surprising, often beautiful and poetic connections between us and each other and us and the world around us.
Well, I should follow up on something that you said there in that trailer, which is essentially the obscure mathematical Benford's Law and Beyonce, the connection there. I must confess, I didn't get it yet, but so maybe you could help me out.
Well, let me first explain what Benford's Law is.
Good idea.
Make it easier. So Benford's Law is this kind of astonishing natural pattern that you can find in almost every giant data set of numbers. So just take any seemingly random batch of numbers like stock market prices or, I don't know, your tax returns or something. If you take all of those numbers and then you strip just the first digit, you're only looking at the first number of those numbers, the first digit. Now, you'd think that every number out of 1 through 9, they would appear 1/9 of the time, right? It's a random data set, effectively. But what you find is actually that's not the case at all. Out of that random batch of numbers, about 30% of them will start with a 1. And then it'll get less and less and less frequent. So 2 is less frequent, 3 is less frequent, 4 less frequent, until you get to 9, which is only it's less than 5% of the time, which is just so strange that random numbers would follow this. It makes a really pretty curve. And so alone, that feels like, okay, maybe that's just a kind of a weird factoid, a surprising factoid. But then to me, the astonishing thing was you could see all these different realms of our world where this applies and is actually quite helpful. It's helpful to catch tax cheats. It's helpful to find Twitter bots. It's helpful to sniff out election malfeasance. And the way that it connects to Beyonce is we found a paper where a scientist applied it to the durations of notes. So if you take a song or a discography of a certain artist, like I think they used something like Beethoven, and they used more classical music. But if you add the durations of the individual notes, it follows this same pattern. It's this pattern that sort of is in all of these places where nobody expected it to be and where nobody was sort of purposefully putting it.
Thus the connection. Let me ask you another one of these seemingly random points, but you bring it up in your series as well. Dust from the Sahara Desert fertilizes Amazon rainforests in South America. How does that happen?
So it's an incredible thing. Basically, there's this one spot in the Sahara Desert, which used to be, it's a kind of a dried up lake bed from 1,000 years ago. And basically, there are kind of mountains nearby placed in such a way that it creates this wind tunnel effect, and it kicks up all this dust way high into the atmosphere, which then, exactly as you can see there, it carries it fully over the Atlantic Ocean. Some of it winds up on the Gulf Coast of North America. Some of it actually crosses Mexico or Central America into the Pacific Ocean, and some of it lands it kind of sprinkles itself down over the Amazon rainforest and provides kind of replenishment of much needed nutrients that the Amazon rainforest needs to kind of keep going.
Amazing. How challenging is it for you, because you are dealing in, sometimes very complicated scientific theories and so on. How difficult is it to sort of break that down for an audience that may not know anything about science? You've opened the door to it for us because of your enthusiasm and so on. But how hard is that to do?
Well, it is tricky. I mean, you need to, in a way, I think it's almost the harder thing is to make it make sense to myself. Once it makes sense to me, it's much easier for me to explain it to everybody else. So part of it is figuring out how to make it make sense to me. But then also another part of it is sort of, I've found in my career, leading with the question is so much more powerful, so much more helpful than kind of trying to just explain it as an answer, as just to say, here's a factoid that that I'm just going to present to you sort of fully formed. If instead you ask it as a question, this dust is being kicked up. Where is it going? Let's follow it. And how do we know where it's going? So once you start to see, scientists have seen it over here and scientists have seen it over here, but how could it go from there to there? All of a sudden, I think people have a higher threshold of complexity than most TV gives them credit for. I think your show is a testament to that. But also, if you lead with the question, people will follow you to even if there are a few kind of complicated speed bumps along the way, people will follow you to get to that answer.
You've obviously been all over the world and seen some pretty amazing things, but I really need to know what the craziest thing that's happened to you was in the course of making this show.
Well, speaking of the dust, one of the things we did was in order to kind of see how that dust actually falls down over the Amazon rainforest, we went to this place called the Amazon Tall Tower Observatory, which is basically like a giant skyscraper in the middle of the Amazon rainforest where there are no other buildings. It's basically the size of the Eiffel Tower. And the day I went there, of course, the elevator was broken, so we had to take the stairs. And so we went with the stairs all the way up. We had this expert with us, a meteorologist. We finally get up to the top. I mean, and it took maybe an hour and a half to just climb the stairs. All the camera ops had the gear, and it's we were all drenched in sweat. We just get to the top. I start to do my interview with the expert at the top, and it couldn't have been a minute, maybe 2 minutes. He looked out. He's a meteorologist, and he said, "Oh, that's a storm cloud. Like there's a thunderstorm coming. We're basically on an enormous lightning rod. If we stay here in 10 or so minutes, we're going to be electrocuted. We got to go." And so we basically we did maybe like a minute and a half or so of the rest of the interview, and then we just beelined down, kind of jumping down these stairs. It took us probably about an hour and a half, as I said, to get up there. It probably took us about 10 minutes to get down.
And did in fact the storm come, and did in fact the tower get hit?
It actually, as a testament to how complicated meteorology is, even this prediction, this 10 minutes out prediction from the height of the clouds, the cloud passed by the tower, and we would have been fine.
Wow. I want to take you back. You grew up, as we pointed out off the top, in the province of Ontario, and at what point did it was there a eureka moment where you decided, I need to be a science journalist?
There wasn't necessarily there wasn't a eureka moment about science, but there was kind of I feel like I was primed to become a reporter. I have one sister; she's also a journalist, and both of us, the thing we credit to our kind of love of asking questions, of kind of keeping up with the world around us, is that our dad would do this kind of amazing thing, which is that every morning, our dad is a very, very early riser. He would wake up really early and go to the mosque every morning and try to drag us along, but we were kids who couldn't be bothered to wake up that early. But the thing he would do is after the mosque, he would read the entire Toronto Star. And we'd still be sleeping. This is my memory of being woken up like every morning of my childhood. He would burst into my room, almost like Kramer style from Seinfeld. And he would tell us the stories of the day. He would just he would just go and he would tell us. And it didn't matter that I didn't understand half of what he was talking about. I mean, I would pick up on the fly, and, I'd be like the only middle school kid who could tell you all about the Bre-X gold mining scandal or something, It was an amazing thing. It was a kind of the kind of education that I think most kids don't get, and the kind of education that inspired us to say, hey, there's exciting stuff going on out there. I want to know all about it.
Latif, I love the way that you say, I have one sister who happens to be a journalist as well, because, let me just think here. Yeah, 2 years ago, you may recognize this person. Well, the one on the left is me, and the one on the right co-hosted the Ontario election leaders debate with me. And I'm pretty sure you know her, don't you?
That's my sister. Latif Nasser from Global News.
Okay, so I want to know how much smack you two talk to each other about who the better journalist is.
Oh, well, the funny thing is that, I feel like until now, I had ceded TV to her, and I was the radio guy, and she was the TV person. And now I'm kind of encroaching on her zone. But she's taking to it very nicely. But yeah, I think we're a little bit territorial. I think a little bit competitive. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe she's going to expand into radio. Then I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, in terms of territorial, what? You give her Canada and you insist on the rest of the world? Is that how it works?
That's maybe it too. But she's there's more than enough in Ontario to keep her busy.
No kidding. No kidding. Well, I have to say it was a great experience co-hosting that debate with her. She was absolutely terrific. Okay, let's move on here. You've got a PhD in the history of science from Harvard. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
Okay, how has that helped shape the reporting that you do? Because this just in, I bet you there are not too many reporters that have got a PhD in anything from anywhere. So that makes you a little bit distinctive.
Yeah, I think to me the fun about this particular field, which a lot of people don't even know exists, the history of science, it's taking the big, ambitious, kind of almost existential questions often of science, and life and death stakes pressing questions of science, and finding a way to historicize them, to kind of turn them into stories about people who are trying to answer those questions, people who are sort of, trying their best, who are coming up with experiments, who are trying, let's say public health measures or whatever else. It's a way to take science, which can often be cold and feel lifeless and very sterile, and finding the human beating heart behind it. And so I feel like that's the thing I studied, and now that's very much the thing that I do. I try to tell those stories in such a way that they feel human. They don't feel like they are just some sterile paper, some stack of facts that you couldn't care less about because so often they're not.
Well, you may have answered the question, but let me follow up anyway here. What would you say is the single most important thing that you, as a science journalist, need to remember as you're trying to convey facts to what is certainly not going to be, a science-based audience? What do you need to remember?
I think it's a tightrope you have to walk where you can't be too breathless and just swallow everything and not ask any critical questions and just say, oh, science knows everything, because it doesn't. You need a healthy skepticism. That's baked into the very fundamental premise of science. At the same time, you can't just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, nothing matters. Nothing is knowable. We, all these scientists are shills and are corrupted by this or that or the other thing, or this thing is just unknowable, because it's not. We really do know things. It really does. It really will save lives to wear masks. But how do you kind of keep that healthy skepticism while also kind of say, you know what, this is the best we have to go on. This is what we all need to do. Walking that tightrope is a tricky thing. And it's, I think what I try to do is sort of present both these cases to the viewers and let them, with their hopefully good judgment, parse and decide for themselves.
Latif, who was detainee 244 at Guantanamo Bay Prison?
Yeah, this I was shocked to find that there was a detainee at Guantanamo Bay, and I found kind of totally serendipitously, I mean, I guess if that's the right word, on Twitter, that there was a guy at Guantanamo Bay with my exact name. I'm Latif Nasser. His name is Abdul Latif Nasser, which was a name I also went by when I was when I did a foreign exchange in Morocco, which is where he was from. Anyway, I found this guy who I just all of a sudden needed to know so much more about him. There was almost no reporting about him. And I started digging. I found this kind of WikiLeaks rap sheet from the Department of Defense, from the U.S. Department of Defense, about what he did, saying basically that he was Al-Qaeda's top explosives expert, a very important military aide to Osama bin Laden. And then I found his lawyer. I talked to his lawyer, who told me, no, he was never in Al-Qaeda. Didn't know bin Laden, wrong place, wrong time. Had nothing to do with any of that. And the United States government in Guantanamo Bay has kept him a prisoner for almost now going on 20 years without trial, without charges. And in fact, on the opposite side, having unanimously cleared him for release back to Morocco, but he's just sort of sitting there without ever having any kind of due process, 20 years later. And so I found out about this guy, these two kind of as polar opposite as you could possibly get portraits of him. And I needed to find out more. And so that was sort of the jumping off point for a 6-part miniseries I did for New York Public Radio.
That was a podcast series, yes?
That's right, yeah. And called The Other Latif. The Other Latif.
And are you satisfied that in your own mind you actually got to the bottom of his story?
I did and I didn't. I mean, I wasn't, because he's at Guantanamo, which is this sort of black hole. The way I talked about him is this man was kind of a black hole in a black hole. I wasn't able to access him, to talk to him, to interview him. And so many of the other sources that I had, whether they be former Guantanamo detainees who had been tortured about their stories, whether it had been, former like intelligence agents, spy type folks, or government, bureaucrats in the United States who were very loath to talk about this, blight on American foreign policy. Nobody would talk to me. So we were basically, I was dealing with crumbs, like evidentiary scraps, and kind of trying to knit them together as best I could. I'm sure I got things wrong because it's just, there was so little evidence to go on. But I think and hope one day more of this evidence will come out. If not, Abdul Latif Nasser himself will be released, and I can get more of that story and and correct maybe what the extrapolations I sort of necessarily needed to make to do a story about this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I presume you'd love to meet him someday and just have a chat with him.
Yeah, and ask him ask him all the questions. I worked for 3 years on this series, and I had so many questions. Why did he make this turn? Why did he make that turn? So much of the evidence against him seemed to have been sort of made up or grossly exaggerated. While on the other hand, there were some that I found quite solid basis for. I joked that the closest thing he ever had to a trial was right here in my garage studio, because he never got one any other place. I'd love to sit down and talk with him and ask him what actually happened. What's your life story? How did you wind up at Guantanamo?
I want to ask you about curiosity over authority. And to that end, you said something once upon a time, which was you'd much rather be the so-called dumbest guy in the room than the smartest guy, because that's more intellectually honest. What do you mean by that? Well,
I do the same thing as you do, which is that we ask questions for a living, and we do that on purpose because we don't think we have all the answers. There are people out there who devote their lives to trying to understand some of the biggest mysteries of our world, of our societies, that often they're not just sort of these academic abstract mysteries. They're these mysteries that really have major stakes, in some cases, like as we can see with COVID, life and death stakes. To me, I don't want to be the guy who comes in and pretends to know everything or even something, because I think that on the one hand, as a proxy for the viewer, I think I'm just the ambassador for the person who's sort of half-heartedly watching while they're cooking their dinner or whatever. So I have to be that person. But on the other hand, I think it's just genuinely true. I mean, so often in my studies, in my reporting, things I thought I knew so deeply and that were so rock solid turned out not to be. And so for me, I think that the best place to approach this job of conveying, important information, of asking people really big questions, is to come in kind of and check your assumptions at the door, and to genuinely ask the question, not just pretend to ask the question so that I look smart, but to actually genuinely ask the question, which is something that I actually value your work as well.
I was just going to say that's what I try to do every day of my life, and so I'm with you on that one. Or as the kids say today, I feel you on that one, Latif. We're down to our last minute here, and I want to just ask you finally about the irony of the title of your series, which is Connected, which is, of course, something that the world is really not supposed to be doing right now. We're supposed to be physically distanced from one another in order to beat this pandemic. How do we stay connected while at the same time fight this damn pandemic?
Well, one kind of irony, I think, from the show is that even if you don't think you are connected, even if we are sort of staying in our homes, even if we are, sort of sealed off in our respective countries, the air we breathe, the selfies we post, the poop we poop, these things, they actually connect us in deep ways that we kind of, I think, so often take for granted. I mean, there is definitely something to be said for, call up your relatives who you haven't talked to in a while, check in on people because you don't know what they're going through. But even beyond that, we are all connected in these deep ways that we just barely have an inkling about.
Well, I have to say it's a delight to meet the other journalist in the Nasser family, having already met the first journalist in the family. But you gave yourself the title of ambassador, and I kind of like that. So let me thank Ambassador Latif Nasser for coming on to TVO tonight, and we are happy to recommend Connected on Netflix for everybody. Season 2 in the works, incidentally?
If they let me, I mean, I got a lot of ideas, but we'll see what happens. Netflix,
they got lots of money, buddy. Go after them.
Yeah.
They got lots of money. You go get them.
Thanks, Steve.
It's been a real pleasure to meet you. Lots of luck going forward. The 6 months that have elapsed since a global pandemic was declared may feel like an eternity, but it's a blip in time compared to how long it normally takes to develop a vaccine for such a scourge. With the world eager for progress and a return to normal, let's find out where things stand and how Canada is contributing to the effort. Joining us now in Picton, Ontario, Dr. Alan Bernstein, President and CEO of CFAR and a member of Canada's COVID-19 Task Force. In the nation's capital, Jason Nickerson, Humanitarian Affairs Advisor for Doctors Without Borders. And in Calgary, Alberta, the Toronto Star's Alex Boyd. And Dr. Bernstein, we're happy to welcome you back to the program. And Jason and Alex, nice to have you here for the first time. Let me just start by reading an excerpt from Foreign Affairs magazine that'll get us off to the races here with our discussion. Sheldon, if you would, the graphic. That sort of vaccine nationalism, or a my country first approach to allocation, will have profound and far-reaching consequences. Without global coordination, countries may bid against one another, driving up the price of vaccines and related materials. Desperate governments may also strike short-term deals for vaccines, with adverse consequences for their long-term economic, diplomatic, and strategic interests. The result will be not only needless economic and humanitarian hardship, but also intense resentment against vaccine-hoarding countries, which will imperil the kind of international cooperation that will be necessary to tackle future outbreaks, not to mention other pressing challenges such as climate change and nuclear proliferation. Okay, let's get into this. Is geopolitical cooperation as important, Dr. Bernstein, in your view, as acquiring the vaccine itself?
The short answer is yes, Steve. I think it's absolutely critical that we work together, we being the nations of the world, the community of nations, because this virus knows no borders. So if we're going to defeat the pandemic and the virus, we all need to be working together.
Jason, what say you on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's been said many times before that the pandemic doesn't end here until it ends everywhere. And certainly speaking from the perspective of an international medical humanitarian organization that responds to conflicts around the world and provides medical assistance to people who are affected by conflict, natural disasters, disease epidemics, and other emergencies, we're absolutely concerned about how the people that we provide care for are going to be able to access this vaccine, and it's essential that they do.
Alex, what are you finding in your reporting on this?
You know, I think it's worth acknowledging that the argument for working together and for global collaboration is absolutely something that resonates with readers. I've heard this quite a bit from people I've spoken to, that they're very proud of the role that Canada plays on the global stage. But at the same time, I think it's worth acknowledging that Canada is kind of in a tricky position here. We've heard from officials as well that they really value working together. We feel a sense of obligation to the global community. But while there's been kind of some movements toward global collaboration, the COVAX facility, obviously being the big example. Some big players are not participating. The U.S. obviously made headlines, with that decision. And so we're seeing a lot of countries, making it very clear that they're putting money into this, but the fruits of that are for their citizens alone. And so in that context, I think Canada really is trying to sit on the fence a little bit. They're saying we value this global collaboration, but at the same time, they're really, hedging their bets and making sure we lock down some agreements of our own.
Well, okay, let me follow up with Alan on that. I mean, I think it's fair to say the United States has been out there much more aggressively and I think earlier than Canada in signing bilateral deals with various pharma companies to get something going here. How does that affect Canada's efforts to get a vaccine for our citizens in this country?
Oh, I think we've done quite well, actually. In fact, the latest announcement was just yesterday when Minister Anand announced that Canada had purchased vaccines from Sanofi Pasteur GSK, a partnership between those two companies. And prior to that, she had announced 4 different vaccines, all of which we had been recommended by us at the Vaccine Task Force. So I think we have secured what we were trying to do at the task force, which is vaccine candidates that represent a different platform. Because at the end of the day, we don't know which vaccine is going to work. And we don't know which platform is going to work and also be safe. So we now have secured a lot of doses from the 3 different platforms that everybody wants. So I think we're doing quite well.
Alex, I wonder if you could tell us about something called the COVAX, COVAX initiative. What is that?
Definitely. So COVAX is really kind of the big global effort to try to get countries to come to the same table and work together in terms of vaccine, both procurement and distribution. And so we know as of Monday that Canada is in. So we're going to be part of this move to kind of pool money, invest in a slate of vaccine candidates, and then in the hopes that one or several actually work out, those eventual doses will be shared among the member countries. So it is a move towards the global community working together. But critically, there's a second piece of this. It's called the COVAX AMC, or Advanced Market Commitment, and it's the fundraising arm that would raise money to make sure that countries that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it, like Canada, are also able to participate in this. So I think it's going to be really critical to watch not only the fact that Canada is participating in this, but whether or not we're going to step up and fund that move to make sure that countries that can afford it also have a seat at the table. My understanding is that conversation is ongoing. We could expect news relatively shortly, but that's something definitely for Canadians to watch.
And how much would we have had to contribute in order to be part of COVAX?
The short answer is that there's kind of a calculation. I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but there's an ability to order a certain number of doses based on our population. There's also another kind of caveat where you can decide, I would like these two vaccines. I'm less interested in this one. So you can kind of decide which vaccines you're most interested in. So we don't know yet what Canada has committed or what our agreement looks like. I've had this conversation with the federal procurement minister, who has said, they're keeping a lot of these details under wraps. That's a move that's obviously they've been criticized for, but they're saying, it's a really competitive atmosphere out there. And so they're trying to kind of not tip their hand for bargaining. So they're keeping a lot of the details around payment secret at this point. And I would imagine COVAX is probably part of that.
Understood. Jason, let me get you back in here. How satisfied are you with the Canadian government's efforts to find an effective and accessible vaccine to date?
Well, I think that we need to look at all of the different moves that governments have been making as part of the race to get a vaccine, because, as you know, a year ago, this was not on anybody's radar in a significant way. Although many of us had been sounding the alarm for many years, saying that, look, we need to be prepared for how we're going to react and respond in the event of a pandemic exactly like this. We didn't know that it was going to be a coronavirus pandemic and that we would find ourselves today in September 2020 in this situation. So the Canadian government's response has been multifaceted, and indeed many governments have taken this approach. Where we have seen a lot of upfront funding for medical research and development being pushed out to researchers across Canada. And certainly there's a number of research labs that are doing the work that needs to be done to develop vaccine candidates on different platforms. In Canada, that's largely quite early stage work. The conversation that we were just having here about how Canada is going to procure vaccines. This is again is sort of the question of the day is how once we have a viable vaccine candidate that's safe, that's effective, how are we going to get that out to people who need to have access to it? And I think that this is where we're starting to see some really concerning trends where the conversation a few months ago was around how do we create something like COVAX, which didn't exist before, because quite frankly, the global pharmaceutical industry is not set up to ensure global equitable access to new technologies such as this in a quick, timely, affordable manner. And now the conversation has shifted in a slightly different way, where we do see countries that are making moves to secure vaccines through these bilateral agreements. And quite frankly, we have quite a few big questions about what that might mean for global equitable access.
Hold off for a second there on distribution and who's going to get it and how and when. We're going to come back to that in a bit. I still want to figure out more. Alan, maybe I can get you back in here on this. Research. Did we not have a research initiative going with elements in China? And if so, what's the status of that right now?
Well, I think the status of the China initiative is that the seed stock that the Chinese were going to send to Canada has been held up in the Chinese customs. So basically it's stalled, if not over. But I think the good news is that we've recognized that there are a whole lot of vaccine initiatives, both domestically and internationally. And indeed, through the task force recommendations, some of those have been made. So Medicago is a Quebec-based company which is receiving funding, as are the 5 companies internationally that we've also recommended that Minister Anand has agreed on, and we've made deals. So I think we've got we are looking at the task force very carefully at all the basic science programs that are underway and trying to identify the ones that are the most promising, that promise to develop a vaccine as quickly as possible that's safe and effective, and ditto for the international ones. So I think we're in good shape as a country. And just if I could pick up on the international for a moment, Steve, I think I agree with colleagues on this panel that it's very important that we also play our role as part of the community of nations, both for altruistic humanitarian reasons, but also because for self-interest. We know that the whole pandemic started with a single individual in Wuhan being infected with this virus. So if the virus is not stamped out everywhere, it'll just come back and bite us. So it's in our self-interest to participate in facilities like COVAX and other multilateral or bilateral initiatives so that we help get equitable access to a safe and effective vaccine for everybody on the planet.
No, I take
key.
I certainly take your point on that, but some people are going to be wondering why, given how terrible our relationship is with China right now, in part because they're holding 2 of our citizens, I was going to say hostage, but I guess technically in prison. How wise was it to embark on some kind of co-scientific venture with them, given how bad our relations with them are right now?
Well, I can turn that around actually and say, because our relations between the 2 countries is not very good. Science is a great way of crossing borders, just like viruses know no borders. Science knows no borders, and so although I'm not sure this was part of the thinking, this is a good way of bridging between countries. So I wouldn't be critical that we wanted to have a dialogue with a country that we're having troubles with. Quite the opposite. I think we should be opening those doors as much as possible and encouraging dialogue to solve this problem. It's a big problem. I agree with you.
Okay. You've mentioned Minister Anand a couple times. That's Anita Anand, who is the minister in charge of procurement. She's basically got this file. And Alex, let me ask you, what pharmaceutical companies does Canada currently have deals with in hopes of getting a vaccine?
So we currently have deals with 5 different companies. So Moderna, they're based in the U.S. Janssen, it's basically the pharmaceutical arm of Johnson & Johnson. With Pfizer, they're actually working with a German company called BioNTech. And so kind of the hope is that they can use BioNTech's technology and then use kind of Pfizer's muscle to distribute an eventual vaccine, assuming one comes to market. Novavax, and then of course the one that Dr. Bernstein already mentioned, Sanofi, which was just announced earlier this week.
Okay, there's a lot of players, Alex, in this space. So, and to the best of my knowledge, the Prime Minister, the Procurement Minister, the Finance Minister, I mean, none of these people are scientific experts. So how do they know whom to sign deals with and whom not to?
Well, that might actually be a great question for Dr. Bernstein, because the Vaccine Task Force, of which he obviously is a member, was set up to do just that, to provide, science-based evidence to make sure that our political leaders have kind of the best evidence available in front of them. And as already mentioned, part of the calculus here is making sure that we have the 3 main platforms of vaccine represented. There's many ways to skin a cat. There's many ways to make a vaccine. So the goal here is just to make sure that we have as diverse a portfolio as possible. Because I think it's worth maybe reiterating the point that everyone I've spoken to says, we're not really hunting for just a silver bullet here. What is more likely is when we get to the end of this, there will be multiple vaccines that are viable, but maybe useful for different segments of the population. So it's not like there's one vaccine that's going to solve all our problems. We're more likely to end up with kind of like a portfolio of them that used together in different situations for different groups are kind of effective as a group.
Okay, interesting. Dr. Bernstein, you want to come in on that? How do you know whom to recommend to do business with and whom not to, since presumably there are, a lot of reputable players in this space?
We've been meeting almost daily since the beginning of June, we being a group of about 15, scientists, immunologists, people from industry, people from venture capital community. And we've been interviewing all the companies that Alex mentioned and a whole lot of others, really looking at the evidence. What's the evidence that the vaccine that they're producing is showing positive results in early trials, and it seems to be safe or not? And so we've gone through a whole lot, and we've sifted through them. And on the basis of that, we've recommended the 5 that Alex has just mentioned. So, and we're not finished. We still, there's a lot more vaccines out there. And our goal, again, as Alex touched on this, there may not be one vaccine that works for all age groups, all demographics, all occupations, people with pre-existing conditions. And so it's a big mistake to put your eggs all in one basket, even if you knew which one was safe and effective. So I think the task force has been working really hard. I can speak from personal experience. We have 6-hour Zoom calls twice a week. You try that. I think what's been really reassuring to all of us on the task force is that the ministers we report to, which is the Minister of Health and the Minister of Industry, Science and Economic Development, have taken our recommendations extremely seriously and have only recommended to the Minister of Procurement the vaccines that the task force has recommended. So I think Canadians should be reassured that the vaccines that are going forward, based on the evidence we have as of today at least, show great promise.
Jason, I think we may have heard hints of the answer to this next question in that last answer, but let me throw it your way anyway. If somebody else gets to the finish line first, Canadian citizens will have put hundreds of millions of dollars into our efforts to find something. And if somebody gets there first, I guess we want to know whether or not all the money that we put into something that ultimately might be superseded by something else, did that money go to waste? What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I'm a scientist by training, and so my answer is, of course, going to be that money invested in science is never a waste. I mean, we're learning something all the time, and I think it's absolutely appropriate that governments around the world are investing in trying to identify a solution, whether that be in the form of a vaccine or a therapeutic or a diagnostic test or a variety of other things. I think that the key question that Canadians and indeed people around the world need to be asking is what is the return on this investment? What strings have been attached to this funding that's gone out the door? Unfortunately, there is a fairly dismal track record of health technologies being discovered with public funds that end up being licensed out to the private sector that then ultimately become inaccessible and unaffordable for patients when they come to market. This is a bigger problem than just COVID vaccines and COVID in general. But I think that it really speaks to a conversation that we need to have about how we incentivize and support medical research and development today.
I should let Dr. Bernstein come back at that in case he wants to comment.
Well, I think Alex is, you've raised it's a much bigger question than we probably have time for today. I think the fact is, for the COVID pandemic, which is what we're in the middle of, this global crisis, the key to this, the exit strategy from this crisis, is a vaccine, and the investments that for countries like Canada are making are being called at-risk or no-regret investments, in the sense that we don't know which vaccine at the end of the day is going to be safe and effective. And so to expect a manufacturer to make these vaccines when there's no market, if they turn out not to be safe and effective, is unrealistic. And so what countries have been doing, including Canada's, is giving money partly up front with the condition that if it's not safe and effective, we won't provide the rest of the funding. But if it is safe and effective, and if Health Canada approves it, we will buy the whole kit and caboodle. Now, we may end up buying more vaccines than we actually need, because we're buying a lot of doses from 5 different manufacturers so far. But I think the argument there is, if they all turn out to be safe and effective, we can then donate those vaccines, not through COVAX or even through COVAX, but also just unilaterally to countries that matter to Canada. So the Caribbean countries are a good example to me. We have a lot of immigrants from the Caribbean in this country. A lot of Canadians want to go to the Caribbean in the winter. We could donate those vaccines to people in the Caribbean. So I think the question that's been raised, the larger question, is a very valid question. But I think in the middle of a crisis, I think we just got to get on with it and get the vaccines made as soon as possible.
Okay. Alex would want you to know, incidentally, that it was Jason who was making that point and not Alex.
Jason, yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, my apologies.
We move along here. No, not at all. Well, listen, as long as you've got the floor, let me ask you about one research effort that's underway here right now. $600 million apparently to fund research and clinical trials here. What are the big research projects currently underway in Canada? Dr. B, that's for you.
Well, there's a lot of them, actually. I think I'll divide them into two broad categories. One is around how do we get a domestic vaccine as soon as possible. And so there's a lot of efforts. I mentioned already Medicago in Quebec City. There's a group at the Vito, the lab in Saskatoon that's working on this. There's some groups in Vancouver at UBC. So there's a number of efforts elsewhere. I haven't named all of them. I think the second broad category of research is dealing with what are the social issues, the mental health issues of this pandemic. And I think we underestimate them at our peril. And how can we prepare for them for the next pandemic? Because there will be a next pandemic. So there is a lot of research going on. There's also a lot of research going on therapeutics. So one of the most promising areas of research are monoclonal antibodies. These are antibodies that are produced in the lab, which can be given to people who have the disease. So they're not a vaccine, they're a therapeutic. And there's a company in Vancouver called Upselera that has developed a suite of very powerful monoclonal antibodies that I expect to be rolled out soon. Eli Lilly, the drug company, is partnering with them and made that announcement last week. So there's a whole lot of work going on here. I think it's fair to say Canadians should be quite proud of what Canadian scientists are doing to end this pandemic.
Okay. Alex, let me ask you a question that I suspect many Canadians want to know the answer to, and that is based on what as you've been nosing around and reporting on this, if and when a vaccine is available, will it be free?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the whole question of cost is kind of a big question mark at this point. I've seen, some estimates of how much these doses could cost, ranging from like $5 to over $100. I think was China's last discussion for their latest 2-dose vaccine option. But I think at this point, there's just kind of too many questions around which one becomes viable, how it needs to be distributed. Is it one shot? Is it 2-shot? All of which will influence price. One of the things I'm seeing increasingly discussed is one of the new technologies that we have 2 companies that we have agreements with are testing out right now is called mRNA vaccines. It's a new technology. A lot of people think it has a lot of potential, but it has to be stored at a very, very cold temperature, which would affect kind of the cost of distributing it. So I think at this point, just based on my conversations with various companies and people who are kind of watching this, there's just a lot of variables that are going to go into cost. So it's maybe a little bit soon to know how much these are actually going to set us back.
Okay. Jason Nickerson, what's your advice to the government on the vaccine, whether it ought to be free for all Canadians to take?
I think absolutely. I mean, we've been saying this since the start of the pandemic. I mean, the vaccine needs to be free and readily accessible to everyone who needs it. This is absolutely true in the places where MSF works. As I mentioned, we're responding to crises in conflict-affected countries around the world. We can't have cost and price being a barrier to access to vaccines or therapeutics, for that matter.
And Ellen Bernstein, have you made a recommendation to government on this yet?
No, we haven't. It's not part of our purview, so we have not made a recommendation. My own personal view would be to agree with what Jason just said, which is it's in all our interest that everyone be vaccinated. So it's a collective good. So I think we should all be paying for it through our taxes, so that we're all there's no barrier to vaccination because of cost.
Okay. The other tricky question here, Dr. Bernstein, is who gets to decide who gets the vaccine first?
There's been a lot of discussions in Ottawa and also internationally. I think most people would agree that people who are at greater risk should get the vaccine first. And I think it's fairly easy to identify those individuals. They're frontline healthcare workers. I think we all would agree should get the vaccine first. People who live in multi-generational settings, people who work in seniors facilities, people who, indigenous people, I think those and others, those categories of individuals, and we may disagree on which goes first and which goes second and third, but I think that grouping should definitely get the vaccine first. I would add seniors on top of that. So they would get the vaccine first, I think. And I think the analysis that has been done in other countries also do the same groupings. But I don't expect a lot of controversy there. And then we go down from there. The fact is, I think this is important, we're not going to be able to make 20 to 35 million doses, or if we need 2 doses, 70 million doses all at once. So not everybody, even in Canada, never mind the world, is going to have access to these vaccines on day one.
Right. I mean, Alex, presumably, there's 35 million Canadians, and as Dr. Bernstein says, they're not all going to get it on day one. So there presumably is a protocol in place somewhere which agrees upon who's going to get it first and then who's going to have to wait 6 months and so on. Is that how this is going to roll out?
We don't know yet, but to be honest, I find this question very interesting. It's obviously a question that's going to be relevant to all Canadians sooner rather than later. Canada has not yet made public their criteria for who is going to be getting the vaccine first. There is a decent likelihood, I would say that it's maybe roughly based on what the World Health Organization is saying, which is very closely aligned with what Dr. Bernstein mentioned. Frontline workers, seniors, people who are otherwise high risk. They calculate that's probably about 20% of the average country's population. We know the CDC in the States is looking at a fairly similar model as well. So while we don't know for sure what those conversations are in Ottawa right now, that's probably not a bad model to look at as something that they might be looking at as a potential option.
Okay, with just a few minutes to go here, let me ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this graphic here about developing notable vaccines over the course of history. Now, we know the current president of the United States, who's a very stable genius, as he tells us, thinks that a vaccine will be in place on November 2nd, the day before Election Day. I suppose that's possible, but look how long it took polio, a vaccine to come forward, 7 years. A vaccine for the measles took 9 years. A vaccine for chickenpox took 34 years. As we get more recent, the mumps, only 4 years, okay, but then HPV, 15 years. And now COVID-19, of course, we're only into, we're within a year. Jason, you want to start us off on this? What would you trust a vaccine that was available on November 2nd?
Well, I think the key issue here is ensuring that data and regulatory processes are going to be transparent. I think that at the heart of a lot of this discussion and a lot of the critiques of the conversation around safety and effectiveness is fundamentally a question of transparency. We have scientists who want to see the clinical trial protocols, who want to see the data, who want to be able to analyze independently the safety and efficacy of these data and be able to communicate that to the public. And so I think that really this is what we need to be talking about, is how do we communicate effectively and transparently the science and indeed the safety and effectiveness data that underlies any decision about which vaccine is going to be made available and when.
Well, we've got about a minute left here, Alan, and I wonder if you could speak to that. I mean, the trouble is you've got politicians on their schedule saying when they think vaccines are coming forward, they hope, as opposed to what scientists are telling us is really more likely. Weigh in on that, if you would.
Sure. So not to repeat what Jason just said, but I agree with what he said. I would add to that 3 things. First, the science has changed so rapidly over the last few years. So RNA vaccines are a good example. When the Chinese put the sequence of the virus on the web early January, Moderna, the Boston-based company, made that virus in vitro in a test tube within days and had it going in mice with the next week, and then had permission from the FDA to start a phase 1 trial 2 months later. So that's blistering speed for vaccine production. I think the second thing is instead of doing things linearly, first we'll do a phase 1 trial, then a phase 2, then a phase 3, and then we'll manufacture the vaccine. We're doing things we're doing things in parallel. So the manufacturers are starting to make those vaccines as we speak, even before they know whether they're safe and effective, to speed up time. The third thing that's happening is a constant dialogue now between the regulators, Health Canada in our case, and the manufacturers. So the regulators are seeing the data in real time, and if they have questions, they're not waiting till the end of the trials to say, you should be addressing this. They're asking those questions now. And the fourth thing is, I think, is the global collaboration that's going on amongst the scientists in industry, scientists and government, the regulators, has also speeded it up. So I think one of the great things about this is that there's been a sea change in how we make vaccines, that we realize we can actually make these vaccines remarkably quickly, so that for the next pandemic, we shouldn't go through the 5 years, 6 years, the 10 years that you were just talking about, Steve. So I think this has been a huge lesson that we can learn. But I think at the end of the day, the vaccines have to be safe as well as effective. Otherwise, people will not trust the next vaccine that comes along. I think we all understand that, especially, of course, the regulator. So this comes down to trust, and you don't engender trust if you say the vaccine will be ready the day before my election.
Bingo. Dr. Bernstein, Jason Nickerson, Alex Boyd, good of all three of you to join us on TVO tonight. We're really grateful for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, September 24th, 2020. Even if there are no Canadian teams still on the ice, the Stanley Cup Finals are on, and tomorrow we'll meet the voice of Hockey Night in Canada's Punjabi edition. That's Harnarayan Singh. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.